The game's changed massively, so let's take a look at one strong list that's doing well for every single faction in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk 40k army lists in Arks of Omen, 40k's new season that's changed up the game quite a bit. With such a radical shake-up to the game, I thought it was high time to make another version of this strong list for every army video, something I've done a couple of times in the past already. Just something that might help give people a taster of what people are running with each faction. In Arks of Omen there have been a whole bunch of big shake-ups to Warhammer 40k. It has meant that the top thing for a bunch of armies has changed, and perhaps the biggest thing that's made people make changes to lists is the new Arks of Omen detachment, the great big all-encompassing one that allows you to take a bunch of stuff fairly freely, the option to take 4 HQ choices within that same detachment, to take no troops at all if you wanted, or to go heavy on one slot without much backlash in terms of command points. Just about every army has had some interesting rules changes though, plus a bunch of points things, so I thought it would be interesting to go through and see one example of what's doing well. These army lists aren't necessarily going to be the set top thing for a faction, they're just literally one example of an army list that's done kind of well in tournaments over the past 2 weeks. Not really that many events have happened yet, a few grand tournaments and a whole bunch of rogue trader tournaments, some smaller ones, and I've basically been through best coast pairings and has tried to take some of the best examples of competitive lists for every faction. Preferably for most of the armies where I've found it, I've generally gone for an army that's either gone undefeated in a 5-round event or just taken the one loss. In general, the big 5-round tournament ones are quite good for actually zeroing in on lists that do well. Generally, to place highly in those, you generally need the list to be fairly efficient, plus the player to be quite good at the game. Kind of helps to weed out the things that have just got a little bit lucky over the course of 3 rounds. An example like that hasn't been available for every single army that I've found though, so for those I've fallen back on something that's won 3 games in a row at a small local tournament and usually either taken first or second. Still a pretty solid achievement, and definitely gives you one interpretation of what one player might do with the army. In this video I'm going to aim to do one for each major faction of Warhammer 40k, we'll do 2 for the Chaos Space Marines core codex, plus a selection of 6 Space Marine chapters out of their 11 sub-codexes, just so we're not making this into a video that's mainly about Space Marines and a few hangers-on. In any case, let's jump right into it, let's see what people are running, and why it might be strong in Arks of Omen. First up, let's start with the Imperial armies, and we'll do the Marine lists first. Iron Hands certainly seems to be a rising force in the meta. The Devastator Doctrine change seemed pretty excellent for them. They now get the extra AP, reroll 1s, and move and shoot infantry with heavy weapons all game long, all of which are pretty great. This list was run by Michael Duff, who used to take 5th at the Bolton War tournament, winning 4 games out of 5, a tournament of 34 players. The list is a fairly commonly taken Iron Hand successor, Master Artisans and Whirlwind of Rage. Whirlwind of Rage meaning that they're kind of good in combat, exploding 6s to hit, and Master Artisans being a single reroll each time you attack, extra damage boost both at range and in combat. The detachment's an Arks of Omen detachment with the heavy support focus. There's a fair few scary elements in the list, a really big combat hitting unit of Vanguard veterans, a lot of incredibly efficient elite firepower with the Devastators and the Eradicators, and a Relic Contemptor Dreadnought and some land speeders to back them up. The list is led by the Primaris Lieutenant with a Storm Shield and Mastercrafted Power Sword. He takes Rites of War and the Vox Spiritum. The Power Sword Storm Shield Lieutenant got massively better with the Space Marine points cuts. Only 65 points for that loadout is really powerful. There's also a Primaris Tech Marine there, I suspect to body with the Relic Contemptor Dreadnought and have it hitting on 2s. In the troops, there's the common choice of 2 units of 5 Infiltrators with the Helix Gauntlets. They seem to be the most common Space Marine troops these days, denying deep strike and setting off on midfield objectives, and being really quite annoying to kill with that Helix Gauntlet negating a save each turn. Otherwise, for objective scoring and just being generally quite efficient, are 2 units of 5 Scouts. They're in 2 Land Speeder Storms, and they take Sniper Rifles, a Missile Launcher, and Thunderhammer in the unit. Really quite a good efficient little unit now for 110 points between them and the Land Speeder Storm. You get a very fast moving little transport with a squad inside, and the squad is very efficient in the Iron Hands firepower as you get to move and shoot with all of those heavy weapons and even reroll 1s to hit. A Land Speeder Storm with some tooled up scouts actually seems like a very competitive choice now. Those 10 Vanguard veterans take jump packs, lightning claws and chain swords, so not taking storm shields or anything, but they will hit very hard with the Whirlwind of Rage. Iron Hands also have a stratagem for a 5+ feel no pain if they need it, and 1 for +1 to hit. Then perhaps the meat of the damage dealing falls to 3 units of Devastators and 3 units of Eradicators. The Devastators each take 3 Grav Cannons and a Multi-Melter, a Cherub and a Combi Melter and Thunderhammer on the Sergeant. I guess that 2 of those pile into a drop pod for a devastating first turn Alpha Strike. The Multi-Melter upgrade does seem like a sensible one, as that means that you can focus the Armorium Cherub on them and then get to double shoot the most valuable gun. Then the 3 units of 3 Eradicators are some absolutely monstrous anti-tank. They each take the Heavy Melter Rifles and a Multi-Melter. They get to move and shoot with no penalty, and reroll ones to hit with the Iron Hands Doctrine. With damage d6 plus 2, even at long range, they're going to leave a mark on any vehicle that you target. Then they're all supported by a couple of fast-moving Landspeeder Tornadoes with Assault Cannons and Multi-Melters. Again, nice heavy weapons for rerolls, and they're quite cheap and fast expendable units to fight over objectives while still dealing damage. And perhaps the centrepiece of the army is a Relic Contemptor Dreadnought, Volkite Culverins and Cyclone Missile Launchers. That one takes the marks of the ancient Character Dreadnought for 1 command point to not be targeted directly, hide it behind some tough units, and it's also got Merciless Logic as well for the exploding hits on 6s. Any extra attacks generated very likely to hit again, probably due to the Tech Marine giving it a +1 to hit and then re-rolling 1s with the Devastator Doctrine. The Volkite Culverins are perhaps even more vicious than they were previously, with AP-1 all game long. Overall looks like some pretty terrifying damage dealing. Quite a lot of nice units zipping around with objectives for the Infiltrators, Scouts and Speeders, and he could make some good use of Strategic Reserve if he wanted to as well, with either Devastators or Eradicators. Overall, a pretty frightening amount of damage that can come out of this list if they do get a good turn of shooting or 2 in your army. Definitely a force to be reckoned with. Otherwise, for the more Codex Space Marine chapters, I thought it would be interesting to take a look at some Salamanders as well. I feel like they've done very well out of the Space Marine updates, with a bunch of free Melter gear being handed out across a lot of units, and this was a list run by Sean Cushing, who used it to take first at Game & Friends RTT, a 20-player one where the list went 3-0. The list is core Salamanders, and it's using an Elites Focus Arks of Omen detachment, and as you'd expect, there's a fair amount of Melter and Flamer goodness here, with that +1 to wound doctrine being able to last until the end of the game now. Perhaps the most striking thing about the list is the core of 3 big units of 6 Eradicators with the Flamestorm Gauntlets. You really don't want to get just about anything in range of those with the Salamander's buffs. Going through the list, it's led by a Primaris Chaplain who takes Master of Sanctity with the Litany of Faith to defend against mortal wounds, the Canticle of Hate for a +1 to charge, and Rites of War for objectives secured, I'd guess probably on those aggressors. He's backed up by the Firstborn Forge Master Vulcan Hestan as well, and his Forge Father special rule is just absolutely brutal. You get to select 1 core or character unit to reroll hit and wound rolls with any flame or melter weapons, which is just an enormous buff, and you could add that to the +1 to wound that Salamanders already get. It's going to be terrifying whether or not you use it on those aggressors, or that big meaty unit of Eradicators. There's then the Primaris Apothecary as well, who takes Chief Apothecary and Selfless Healer, allowing you to resurrect 1 slain model per turn. I'd guess probably aggressors, though I guess it could be Eradicators too. In the troops, we've got a unit of Assault Intercessors with a Power Fist, and some Incursors with a Haywire Mine. Those big 3 units of 6 aggressors with the Flamestorm Gauntlets, they've got stratagems to make them auto-hit with maximum hits, plus deal out a few mortal wounds, or even fire their flamers in combat. There's 2 units of Stern Guard piling into a drop pod. They've got some pretty excessive melter fire on the go there for just 20 points per model, 3 combi melters, 2 multi-melters and a power fist. Stern Guard were perhaps one of the biggest winners out of the whole free war gear handout. There's 2 Invader ATVs with multi-melters, 5 Devastators with grav cannons and a cherub, 1 unit of 6 Eradicators with the melter rifles, again particularly great targets for Vulcan Hestan's rerolls them, and just a general purpose Redemptor Dreadnought with a heavy flamer rather than an onslaught cannon. I guess with Salamanders that certainly works well. Overall again it's another very efficient and perhaps no less scary version of Space Marine damage dealing. Lots of units whose damage output you just can't really ignore until they're dead. Even a couple of Salamander's aggressors with AP-1 can really put the hurt down on just about any target in the game with the +1 to wound and their stratagem access. Really cool to see Salamanders doing well again. Moving on to the more divergent Space Marine chapters, and first up we have the Blood Angels list that took down the Toronto Winter Open tournament, this one by Sam Procopio, who went 5-0 with it. We have already talked about it on the channel, and it is kind of interesting to see the differences between this and the Las Vegas Open winning list. This one's slightly fewer in terms of characters, and takes just about a little bit of everything really. I do wonder whether it was a bit of an experimental list, just trying out a bunch of units with the new points, though it certainly seems to have come together to be really quite effective. The core of the list does take a bunch of very common Blood Angels picks, a Chapter Master with a jump pack, Relic Blade, Inferno Pistol, Rites of War, Visitor of Death, and Soul Warden. Basically very similar to what Dante does, but you can choose the Relics and Warlord traits, which definitely is one advantage. They're then backed up by a sanguinary priest who's a chief apothecary, selfless healer, and has the armor Indomitus to keep him a bit safer. He can be resurrecting sanguinary guard or others, as well as doing his feel no pain and healing things. Both of those are supporting a solid core of sanguinary guard, a unit of 5, 6, and 7 of them. Compared with the normal swords, axes, and bolt guns, they're mixing in a bit more special gear this time. There's a few power fists in there, and one unit takes 4 Inferno pistols. Now the Inferno pistols are free, I wonder if people might start to take them quite a bit more. In the troops again, there's 2 units of Infiltrators with the Helix Gauntlets, 1 unit of Incursors with the Haywire Mine, and then a really quite interesting mix of other stuff. 5 Scouts with Thunderhammer Heavy Bolter, Sniper Rifle and Camo Cloaks, all those in a Landspeeder Storm. 5 Assault Marines with a Lightning Claw Inferno Pistol and 2 Plasma Pistols. A unit of 5 Plasma Inceptors, which Games Workshop has now nerfed. I guess that would have to be traded out for something different, probably some other damage dealers. 3 Outriders and 3 Eradicators with a Multi-Melter and 2 Heavy Melter Rifles. Definitely a whole load of things going on besides the solid core that Blood Angels generally rely on. I guess you could certainly throw some Eradicators into Strategic Reserve and just have them be an annoying nuisance threat that's going to punish something big. I think it's quite cool to see a unit of 3 Aggressors here as well. You could maybe have those lurking behind terrain as a bit of a countercharge unit that's really quite threatening both at range and in melee. In any case, really cool to see Blood Angels doing well and with such a variety of units as well. Kind of bodes well for them going forth into Arks of Omen, even though losing Armor of Contempt probably is kind of bad news for the Sanguinary Guard and the Death Company. Next up for the Wolves of Russ, we've got this list by Christopher Wright, 13th at Adelaide Open, though it was a 7-1 list at a 220 player event. When you have events of this size, getting this kind of performance is basically the equivalent of a podium place at plenty of smaller tournaments, and anything around the top 20 lists are generally very, very competitive indeed. This Space Wolf list is a Space Wolf successor with Born Heroes and Whirlwind of Rage, an Arks of Omen list with the fast attack focus, though admittedly like the Blood Angels list, this one was running pretty heavy on the Plasma Inceptors, so again we'd have to change them out for something else going forward, as I feel like no one's really going to want to run them now Games Workshop decided they should be 60 points, not 40. In general, the list has a couple of biker characters zipping around with the Inceptors, plus some Sky Claws and some Long Fangs turning up as well, and again some Scouts, this time some Wolf Scouts zipping around in Landspeeder Storms. Perhaps one of the most striking things about the list is the use of the Wolfguard pack leaders. They became absolutely crazy in terms of value in the new point system, and they're present on the Skyclaws and the Longfangs. Going through the list in turn, the Bike Captain's a Chapter Master with a Combi Melter Power Fist, Saga of the Hunter, and Armour of Rust. He can get where he needs to be quickly, and Armour of Rust handout fights last. Once he's made a charge as well, he can have a pretty ludicrous threat range with units nearby, allowing them to advance and charge. Supporting him, there's a Primaris Bike Chaplain. He's got Master of Sanctity with Wise Orator and Benediction of Fury, the Relic Trozius for more hitting power. He's got the Canticle of Hate for the charge boost, and Recitation of Focus for +1 to hit. I'd guess that might have been aimed at the Plasma Scepters, though could have been usable on the Longfangs. There's also a Primaris Lieutenant as well, with Mastercrafted Power Sword and Storm Shield and Rites of War. Again, he seems like quite a popular choice for the points that he costs. Otherwise, moving through the squads, there's 5 Infiltrators with the Helix Gauntlet, pretty stock for either holding down a midfield or a home objective. Very heavy use of Wolf Scouts here, 3 units of them with the Camo Cloaks, Thunderhammer, Combi Melter and Melter Gun, and Plasma Pistol. Space Wolf Scouts are just a little bit better as they get an extra special weapon option, so can choose to take, say, a Melter Gun instead of a Heavy Bolter or something. Again, they're all zipping about in Landspeeder Storms. Again, there's the 2 big units of 5 Plasma Inceptors. That would free up 400 points to spend on other things if you weren't running them now. Plenty of decent choices where Space Wolves are concerned. You could have any of the elite melee damage dealers, plus more fire support choices like multi-melters maybe. Then we get into some of the really interesting squads. 3 units of 6 Sky Claws, including the Wolfguard pack leader. They get 2 Melter Guns in the unit, a Power Fist on the regular pack leader, and then the Wolfguard pack leader with the Thunderhammer and Storm Shield, a pretty insane value model at only 20 points for that one. Skyclaws were kind of good already, but the pack leader and 3 Melter Guns takes them to the next level. There's one lone helpful Cyberwolf for either sitting onto objectives or forcing enemies to move and deal with it, which they won't want to do for 15 points. And then perhaps some of the most terrifying and efficient units in the list are 3 units of 6 Longfangs. These guys are absolutely stacked. 2 of the units take 3 las cannons and 1 grav, 1 takes quad grav cannons. They've got the Armorium Cherub to fire a gun twice, a Melter Gun and a Power Fist on the Sergeant, and then the Wolfguard pack leader, who's only 34 points in Terminator armor, and he takes a Cyclone missile launcher and a Thunderhammer, both of which are completely free upgrades now. Really quite mad that you can get a Cyclone Missile Launcher Terminator just inserted into the squad like that. If you were taking 4 las cannons in a unit, you could up that from 4 to 6, plus fire something twice with the Armorium Cherub. Otherwise, just pretty interesting to see a selection of units run by the new Space Wolves. It's been a bit of a flip from the Wolfguard pack leaders being just a little bit on the overcosted side to becoming absolute staple auto-includes. The Dark Angels are shaping up to be perhaps one of the strongest Space Marine chapters in the new Arks of Omen. This list was run by Damien Ridgewell, who used it to take second at Uprising Adelaide, again the big one with 220 players. This one's an elites focused detachment plus some heroic support, not using either the full Deathwing or Raven Wing and instead going for a bit of a mix, which does seem to be the way that most people are running them. In the list, there's 2 enormous units of Deathwing Terminators with Thunderhammer and Storm Shield. Each of those have 2 Cyclone Missile launchers in them and the Watcher in the Dark. Massively efficient all round with their transhuman physiology, but 33 points Thunderhammer Storm Shield Terminators are great anyway with transhuman. It looks like they're supported by Captain Lazarus for some protection against mortal wounds, and a Deathwing Chapter Ancient with a Thunderhammer and Storm Shield with the Watch traits for an automatic psychic denial, Rites of War to give them Obsec, and the Pennant of Remembrance to make one of them -1 damage. Otherwise, perhaps for a bit of work on objectives and protecting the characters, there's a small Deathwing command squad with a Thunderhammer and Storm Shield and another Psychic Denial Watcher. And again 2 units of the Infiltrators with the Helix Gauntlets, again pretty much excellent Phobos troops to be able to hold down the midfield or your home objectives and deny deep strike. Then there's the scary Raven Wing bit of the list, 3 big units of attack bikes with multi-melters supported by multiple characters. Their Devastator Doctrine is pretty excellent and can now carry on for multiple turns if they want. It means the bikes can move 17 inches base and advance and shoot their main guns if they need to, and then they can get supported by rerolls with Samael and the Ravenwing Talonmaster with Arbiter's Gaze. The Talonmaster puts out a fair amount of fire as well. There's also a Ravenwing Apothecary with Selfless Healer. He'll make the durability of any units that he's with better, plus can resurrect slain Terminators or Ravenwing bikes. Overall, it's a fairly scary hammer and anvil approach, it would seem. Next up, I wasn't able to find quite as many examples of Black Templars lists doing well, but this one was one that topped out a Rogue Trader tournament, going 3-0 against a field of 23 players, an elites focused Arks of Omen detachment with a good mix of units. To head up the army, John Heath's force, who took first at the Player Promoter RTT, had Grimoldus, Helbrecht, and the Emperor's Champion. Grimoldus takes the Divine Protection and Fires of Devotion listeners, so that's the 5+ Feel No Pain plus the combat buff. The Emperor's Champion is maybe a bit more of a rare choice compared to some of the other HQs, but good to see him working here. Otherwise, for the rest of the list, I'd say maybe not everything's absolutely 100% optimised, but like the Blood Angels list, it's quite cool to see a good variety of units. There's some Assault Intercessors with that damage 3 Fist of Balthus, a set of 5 Incursors for midfield objectives, 4 Aggressors with a Bolt Storm and Frag Storm and the Icon of Heinemann, 4 Blade Guard, one of which has the Crux Obsidian for a bit more toughness and Champion of the Feast, an enormous block of 10 Assault Terminators with the Thunderhammers and Storm Shields, who I'd guess would be the normal target for Divine Protection. They are very hard to remove just on their raw points value, and are going to be even harder there. 10 Vanguard Veterans with dual Lightning Claws, which is always cool to see, though I do suspect that the extra Lightning Claws just paying a bit too much for the extra 1 attack. I guess they might be getting some mileage out of the 5+ Invul Vow if that was taken. Then there's 5 Eradicators, 2 Landspeeders with multi-melters, and an Impulsor with a multi-melter and shield dome. I'd guess that might well be the Blade Guard plus the Emperor's Champion riding in that one. Overall, interesting to see how a Black Templars list is adapting to the new meta, and no Crusader squads in this one at all despite the points cut. Looks like the Thunderhammer Terminators have stolen their glory a bit. Moving out beyond Space Marine land, here we've got an Adepta Sororitas list. Again, this one was won from the Uprising Adelaide tournament, going 5-1 against a field of 220 players. Perhaps as expected, it's a Bloody Rose list, and usually using the Passion Sacred Rites. That's the one that doubles down on the big melee buffs from the Bloody Rose, with some exploding 6s to hit in combat. It's an elites focus Arks of Omen detachment, and goes pretty heavy on the elite melee infantry, with Zephyrin, Repentia and Sacrosants being here in big numbers. Heading up the list is the Scary Canoness. She takes the Bloody Rose unique Mina's Wrath Power Sword for damage 2 and some mortal wounds, a Plasma Pistol and a Rod of Office, and the Blazing Eye Bloody Rose Warlord trait for some extra long threat ranges, and the powerful Word of the Emperor upgrade to allow an enemy unit to fight last, plus sacrifice a Miracle Dice to turn off some invul saves if she needs to. Otherwise, there's the fast reliable threat of Celestine and the Gemini, who can regenerate when they die, a Dog Martyr to provide some obsec, probably to the Sacrosants I guess. She takes the refrain of blazing piety and the litanies of faith, and perhaps most interestingly the triumph of St. Catherine, the great big procession of relic bearers, as a fairly generalist and annoying midfield threat. Then for the units, it does seem that troops are still being used, at least in this list. There's 2 Battle Sister squads and a unit of Sisters Novitiates to bring some objectives secured, plus doing actions and things. A whole bunch of Sacrosancts with 2 units of 8 of them and 1 unit of 5, mainly with maces but a few halberds mixed in. They definitely seem a lot more standout now the rest of the army lost Armour of Contempt, but these girls didn't. There's 3 Paragon Warsuits with multi-melters and the War Maces, 2 big solid units of Repentia with their scary melee profile, even at the upgraded cost of 16 points, and then 3 decent sized units of Zephyrim as well, 2 big ones that take the pennant and 1 smaller one, and finally a Sororitas Rhino, I'd guess probably for some of the Repentia. Overall, a lot of solid Bloody Rose damage here. It is fairly Puritan in a melee list, not all that much heavy firepower besides those Paragon multi-melters. I kind of feel like the updates to the game didn't really change much in terms of a lot of players just wanting to run Bloody Rose and combat. Moving on, we've got the Adeptus Custodes list by Liam Hackett that won the Uprising Adelaide tournament. Custodes look like they came through the changes from Arks of Omen really quite well, getting some OBSEC units, some points cuts, and some helpful stratagem changes. And this list was really quite an interesting Custodes list as well, being a solar watch list with the elites focused that spammed a whole load of Wardens and Terminators. Heading up the list is the ever-reliable Trajan Valoris with his warlord traits for farming command points and things. There's a Dawn Eagle captain with the Hurricane Bolter and the Tip of the Spear upgrades for the solid combat rerolls. A Vexillus Praetor in Alaris Terminator armor, who is loaded with a few upgrades, including Sally Forth to allow units to advance and charge each turn, I'd guess one of the Warden blocks, and also the Castellan's Mark to presumably redeploy those enormous units exactly where they need to be. There's finally a Leia as well, who I was corrected in the last video on this, is probably here to teleport in units with the Teleport Homer stratagem, meaning that you could put some Terminators on midfield objectives turn 1 when she gets out of the Rhino with the Witch Seekers in. Then for the squads themselves, there's 1 block of the 3 Terminators with the axes, 2 individual Terminators with axes, who are quite small and annoying disruptive threats with objectives secured now. Those 2 enormous bricks of Custodian Wardens with the Guardian Spears. They're going to be excellent targets for a bunch of stratagems, including the ones that you can use multiple times a game now. And then 5 Witch Seekers with the AP-1 Flamers and some Psychic Denial in a Rhino. They get to make a pre-game scout move, so can get a layer to the mid-board if they need to. Overall, really quite a cool list, and very nice to see Custodians doing well without relying on excessive Forge World. Moving on, we've got an Imperial Guard list. They have played somewhat highly at a couple of grand tournaments, but I felt like this list from Connor Nichols was a pretty good example of what Guard have to offer at the moment. This one placed rather highly at a 3-round tournament, quite a big one of 38 players in East Anglia. This one goes down the Catechin, Russ and Mortars routes like quite a lot of Guard lists are doing right now, and uses the Born Soldiers regimental trait for the 6s to hit auto wound the enemy, particularly nice on things like AP-1 las guns and spammed heavy bolters and mortars. It's an Arks of Omen detachment with a heavy support focus to get you some mortars plus plenty of Russes. Heading up the list is a Cadian command squad with the Voxcaster plasma gun and that Finial of the Nemradesh first. That's the relic that's really quite good for core firepower. It allows core units to ignore modifiers, feel no pains, and now even -1 damage abilities. Very solid when it's next to any infantry, whether it's Cadians, Kazakin, or mortars. There's Lord Solar Leontus with his massively flexible orders and his Grand Strategist Warlord traits to farm some CP. He's perhaps best paired with the Kazakin for his awesome rerolls of everything to hit and wound, maybe particularly the one that's likely going to be teleporting across the board with the Barbican's Key. He can juice them up with Take Aim and 4 rerolls before they go. Then there's a Tank Commander for some more tank orders with the Gatekeeper Battle Cannon, really quite an efficient big gun, a Las Cannon, Heavy Bolters, and Master Tactician. That's the one that allows you to redeploy a few units, potentially also putting them in strategic reserve if it makes more sense. Really quite nice, I guess, for either playing aggressively or very defensively with the Rosses to make sure that they hit the enemy first. For the infantry units, there's a decent amount of bodies to hold the line and take the objectives, 5 units of 10 Cadian shock troops with 2 plasma guns, a few waves of screening and objective holding, plus can actually punch up fairly hard with that Finial relic. I'd guess that 2 of them are probably riding in the Tauroxes, though perhaps one of the Kazakin units is destined for them. There's 2 units of the ever-popular Kazakin, with 2 hotshot volley guns, 2 plasmas and a Voxcaster. One of them takes the Barbican's Key and veteran guerrillas, the one to ignore cover, and one takes heirloom weapons for extended range. Lightly manning the home field objective, there's then 3 units of 3 mortars, hiding out of line of sight, probably next to the command squad with the finial. These guys can just put out some pretty consistent volume fire on exactly what is needed. Not quite as helpful against big armies with high toughness and 2+ saves, but will really mess up anything that's both light infantry and kind of valuable. Eldar and Harlequins certainly don't get on well with these. Then for the heavy armour, we've got 4 more Lehman Russes. 3 of them are the fairly stock pattern of Executioner, Lascannon and Heavy Bolters, squadroned into a unit of 2 and a single one. They're great damage dealers and even quite fast and flexible with orders from the Tank Commander and Lord Solar. The last Russ is a feared Vanquisher Lehman Russ with a Vanquisher Cannon, Las Cannon and the Elite Sharpshooter's Tank Ace trait bought in. That means you've got the big gun that can puncture enemy invul saves and you can reroll when it fails to hit. As mentioned, we've got 2 Tauroxes for the troops to ride about in, and then 2 individual Sentinels with a Las Cannon, both the scout pattern ones for the forward deploy. Overall, looks like a pretty solid guard list that shows off some of the strongest things that they can bring to bear at the moment. Some nice Russers and Kazakin for primary damage dealers, some Cadians to hold objectives, and some Mortars for troubleshooting. Moving on, we've got Grey Knights, a list by Miriam Hall, who used this to take third at DZTV GT, with 4 wins to 1 loss. I was interested to see how the Grey Knights would be adapting to the new changes. They did have a bunch of points drops, and it does indeed seem that at least for this list, the Paladins are out and the Dread Knights are back. This list has 3 of them with Sword, Teleporter, Silencer and Psy Cannon, and led by the Grand Master in Nemesis Dread Knight, kind of a similar loadout with Gate of Affinity and Empiric Amplification for the extra damage, and taking the fairly common combo of Servant of the Throne and Sigil of Exigence, 2 ways to keep it remarkably safe, either teleporting away from guns or getting your 3+ invul for a turn. Quite a lot of raw might to the list. The list is a Prescient Brethren one. That's the one with the stratagem for reroll 1s to hit and wound for a unit, the Fatal Precognition power that can deal some mortal wounds when your enemy moves, and the Divination Warlord trait that the Tech Marine takes that allows you to do a psychic action to gain a command point, so he can basically sit around farming that while he's also buffing the Dread Knights. The Tech Marine's also got Unyielding Anvil for a bit of objective secured, and Omen of Incursion. That's basically the pre-game bought Auspex scan one, where 1 core character can shoot that for free if the enemy sets up within 12 inches. Finally, the HQ section's rounded off by a Brotherhood Librarian with the Big Mortal Wound combo, Purifying Flame, Vortex of Doom, the Psychic Epitome Warlord trait for more mortal wounds, and he also takes the Foretelling of Locus, the one that allows you to redeploy units. Then we've got the squads in the army, 10 Strike Marines, mainly with Falchions, 2 Staves, a little bit of objective secured and Hammerhand counter-attack there. Then there's 25 Interceptors, 2 blocks of 10 and 1 blocks of 5. Again, mostly halberds there, though 1/2 squad of the 10 Interceptors takes 5 Staves. They're a bit cheaper now and can get the Strike Marine profile where they need to be for a bit of psychic and melee. Finally, and perhaps one of the most interesting things in the list, is that there's a Purgation squad that's managed to sneak in with some Psy Cannons. That looks like it's mounted in a Razorback, unless that's for one of the Strike Marines or Interceptors. I guess now their Psy Cannons became free, they're a bit more tempting, and might actually be worth some stratagem investment. Overall, maybe feels like a bit of a return to form for Grey Knights, out of what their Codex dropped. Mass Dread Knights and Interceptors again. I feel like they might be coming full circle somewhat. Good to see that they are having a bit of tournament success. I must admit I was a bit apprehensive after the changes, but it seems like they're not doing too bad. Next up, we've got the Adeptus Mechanicus, this one by Ben Warrior, who used it to take 8th at Uprising Adelaide. Admech received some crazy points buffs and some core Cataphrons, and I thought that this list was particularly fun as it's a melee riser Admech list with a lot of heavy close combat, +1 to wound and +1 to charges. Character-wise, the list is headed up by 2 Tech Priest Dominuses and 2 Techno-Archaeologists, and between the lot of them they do bring quite a dizzying array of buffs. The Dominus Priests have their rerolls and some okay melee and shooting profiles. One of them seems really well equipped to support melee with Cetacean in Savagery and the Omniscient Mask, 2 decent combat boosts, and one of them takes Artisan's Supervisory Radiance and the Raiment of the Technomartyr. He'd be able to allow units to reroll hits in melee nearby, and also have units fall back, shoot and charge as well, so it's really quite disruptive in combat. There's then 2 Techno-Archaeologists with their Deep Strike Denial and the ability to do actions while still firing. They take Logi and Genitors, and I wonder if they might be to support the Cataphrons. Speaking of which, the list goes pretty heavily on the new core tracked servitors. There's 3 units of breachers with a few torsion cannons mixed in with their arc rifles, all taking the hydraulic claws, and they look like they'd be pretty savage in combat with Riser. There's 1 unit of destroyers with the plasma culverins. They can make use of Riser's stratagem for +1 damage. And then there's a whole load of infiltrators and rust stalkers, 2 units of 5 infiltrators and 3 units of 10 rust stalkers with the blades. One of them takes the Tempera Copia for a bit of fights last. It looks like the last 3 are all delivered into combat with a couple of Dune Riders and a Terrax pattern Termite drill. I guess the Terrax Termites could be okay in Riser for delivering the units into melee. They do get that +1 to charge, so they've got a pretty reasonable chance of making charges out of Deep Strike. It's pretty awesome to see melee Abmech doing so well. Nice that they're not at the bottom of the pile anymore. Next up, we've got Imperial Knights. Again, an Uprising Adelaide list here by James Mann. Again, this one only took a single loss and came 14th overall on points. Knights maybe didn't gain absolutely loads going into Arks of Omen, but they had a couple of helpful things. Perhaps one of the most useful things was being able to take 6 Lords of War slots now. This list builds around a Crusader Gallant and Paladin, and then for the 4 Armigers there's a Helverin and 3 Warglaves, though they're able to split up the Warglaves into 2 different squads to help with deploying them. This one's a House Tyranids list for the 6+ Feel No Pain. They've taken Defend the Realm and Lay Low the Tyrants, Defend the Realm being the command point farming one that's basically auto-include. Lay Low the Tyrants gives you a reroll each time you attack, but it does mean that farming honor points is a tiny bit harder. Perhaps the main feature of the list is the Paladin plus Crusader combo. The Paladin is the Princeps, so he can give out his big rerolls to the Crusader, and the Paladin also takes Iron Bulwark and a Reaper Chainsword. The Crusader is then the big focus of the damage, taking the Endless Fury Gatling Cannon, Thermal Cannon and Stubber. He's upgraded with Knights of Mars to allow you to flip 1 dice to a 6, Master Tactician for Blessed Arms, so you get extra shots with the Stubbers. And then I suspect the idea that you do with him is to trigger that stratagem where 6s to wound become mortals, so he's capable of dazzling the enemy in a crazy amount of mortal wounds, particularly with that once per game flip to a 6, which becomes every turn once you're virtuous. Otherwise, the Gallant is quite a nice shock knight to throw down the centre and force the opponent to deal with. It's harder to kill with Sanctuary. It has Revered Knight for fights first, plus getting an extra honour point to start with, and Master of Law, which he takes Knight's Faith with. This one is the Litany style ability that allows bonded armigers to get a 5+ Feel No Pain, makes them spectacularly tanky, even more so than they already are. And what's better is that this one works on mortal wounds as well, unlike the Tyrannus 6+ Feel No Pain. Then the Armigers will certainly enjoy the buffs from the Crusader, Gallant and Paladin. They should all be -1 most turns. The Helverin and Warglaves are just stock with the Stubbers, though are remarkably tough to remove when they've got their -1 damage up. Overall, perhaps not the biggest changes for Imperial Knights going into Arks of Omen. They haven't really had any seismic shifts to their army, but are certainly remaining pretty strong. Moving on, let's talk some Chaos, and we'll start with a couple of different flavours of Chaos Space Marine list. This first one run by Dean Simbeck, who used it to take 20th at the Uprising Adelaide tournament. Again, a very good win record with 5 wins and just the 1 single loss. I believe this guy's the chap from the Blog for the Blood God YouTube channel. Thoroughly recommend checking it out if you want more detail on this. It does look like he's done a more proper breakdown. In any case, the list is a Black Legion list with an Elites Focus Arks of Omen detachment. Abaddon's still here despite his 50-point points increase. Admittedly, I think he's still very efficient for Black Legion with the 4 rerolls to hit and wound for a core unit. He's backed up by a full HQ complement, a Dark Apostle with Mark of Slanesh and Illusory Supplication, and he also takes the Cloak of Conquest relic as well. Really quite a nice choice for the Black Legion, giving you an aura of Obsec. That'll be good on those Terminators that are very hard to kill. The Master of Possession also has the Mark of Slanesh and takes Mutated Invigoration and the Pact of Flesh, a fairly standard choice for buffing the Terminators and making them hard to kill. They should be able to have Delightful Agonies, Pact of Flesh and Mutated Invigoration each turn if they need it. Perhaps one of the most interesting picks in the HQ section is a Sorcerer in Terminator armor. He's got the Veilbreaker plates to allow him to teleport with a unit across the board. I'm going to guess that will be to put the Terminator somewhere threatening. Seems like that's to be a lot more use than teleporting a Hellbrute or something. Otherwise, getting to the squads themselves, there's 2 units of Cultists that can now take Stubbers for free. The big block of 10 Terminators to receive all the buffs and the regeneration. They've got the Black Rune of Damnation for the -1 to wound, 4 Combi Mouters, and 4 Fists, 2 of them Chain Fists. There's 5 Raptors, probably handy enough for jumping around, doing actions and reaching small enemy units, and then rather a nice contingent of big stompy war machines. 2 Chaos Decimators with the Soul Burner Petards. They're the ones that throw out ranged mortal wounds, usually around 4 or 5 of them per Decimator, and that is quite intimidating to anything that's got a whole load of barriers to defense. And then perhaps the coolest part of the list is a trio of Hellbrutes with Fist, Multi-Melter and Heavy Flamer. It seems that with the free gear being built in, they're just about getting to where they need to be. I guess they are only 105 points for a fair bit of threat, and they've got that fun Fire Frenzy stratagem that might catch the odd opponent out. Overall, pretty cool to see a new iteration of Black Legion. I feel like the Sorcerer, Decimators and Hellbrutes are all quite cool picks. Moving on for another flavour of Chaos Space Marines, here's an Emperor's Children list that also went 5-1 at that enormous tournament, this one run by Nathan Bleakley. Emperor's Children were certainly doing excellently prior to Arks of Omen, though they will be paying a bit more of a tax compared with other Space Marines now, as everyone who can do has to buy a Mark of Slaanesh for plus 20 points. That's 5 points more than it was before, so might limit options just a little bit. This one's an Elites Focus Arks of Omen detachment using 3 of the 4 HQ slots. This one goes very heavy on the troops though, with an absolute ton of Noise Marines. In the list there's Lucius the Eternal, who's just a very efficient Chaos Lord all around, potentially with damage 3 on his melee, and he makes the enemy fight last. He's backed up by Demon Prince with Wings, Sword and Warp Time. He takes the Mantle of Traitors and Flames of Spite. Flames of Spite for extra melee power. The Mantle of Traitors is the one that allows him to use a stratagem once per game. He can also trigger a fight's last one. He also gets Warp Time too, so he can be moving himself or others around the board a bit quicker. Finally, there is a Master of Possession as well. He again has Pact of Flesh and Mutated Invigoration, plus Liber Hereticus for the Feel No Pain. Interestingly though, this time he's not going to be buffing Terminators, it looks like he's going for those Possessed. I believe he is able to cast Delightful Agonies of them in this list. As an Emperor's Children, they do get the Slaanesh keyword, unlike most other legions. The unit in question is a big 10-strong unit of Possessed with the Black Rune of Damnation, and with the Master's buffs they're going to be hard to remove. Otherwise, a lot of the list is Noise Marines, 6 units of 5 of them, and all of them with that kind of interesting mixed loadout, Chainswords plus a Blastmaster and Icon of Slaanesh. Blastmasters are really savage shooting for the points, but the rest of the squad is kind of a bit more in tune with melee with the Slaanesh buffs, so it makes them an interesting sort of unit, particularly as they can move and fire with the Blastmaster with no penalty. A few of them pick up a little bit of extra war gear as well, with a couple of Power Fists and a Tainted Chain Axe. Again, Power Fists quite nice, as they ignore hit roll penalties in Emperor's Children. Otherwise, there's a couple of Spawn, likely just for a bit of cheap objectives. 2 Chaos Decimators once more, with the Soul Burners for some mortal wounds. I don't know if they're going to become a bit more of a regular staple now. Plus a Venom Crawler to help out the Master of Possession's casting, plus being a generally efficient demon engine. Overall, lots of Noise Marines, some Decimators, and a big Possessed Death Star. Looks like a solid incarnation of Emperor's Children to me. Next up we've got Death Guard. I'd argue an army that seems to be struggling to break through quite as much. I feel like, despite the points cuts in Arks of Omen, losing Armour of Contempt was a big deal for them and their durability. One list that won a small tournament though is this list by Benjamin Britt, first at GMI Games RTT. A small tournament of 12 players. This one's an Inexorable Plague Company list, and it's got a focus on the fast attack. The Inexorable is the one that has the debuff to charge stratagem, plus they get the Ferric Blight traits, which means that you can potentially have the rest of your army be shooting an enemy unit and get extra AP against them. The list is very heavy on the Demon Engine and Death Guard firepower. There's no less than 11 big and scary armoured threats coming at you, 3 Chaos Contemptors with the Volkite launchers and Cyclone missile launchers, a whole load of command points being invested in them as they have that relic keyword, 3 units of the slightly cheaper bloat drones with the flesh mowers at 115 points, 2 of the slightly cheaper Mephitic Blight haulers, and then 3 of the staple Plague Burst crawlers. Lots of Demon Engine wounds to get through there, and particularly the focus fire of those Chaos Contemptors can just blast a lot of threats off the board, particularly if they're running alongside the Death Guard Chaos Lord and the Tallyman, both of which will make their shooting scarier, particularly that Tallyman with Tollkeeper. Otherwise, the rest of the list just has a few troops to score objectives, 3 units of 5 Plague Marines with their assortment of different melee gear, plus a Melter Gun and Blight Launcher, 10 Pox Walkers, and I guess the Death Guard Chaos Lord might be competing a bit better with the Lords of Contagion and things, as now he gets a bit of free gear with a free Bale Sword and Combi Melter. Overall, it's a big armoured list of Nurgle. I do kind of wonder if anyone's going to have some good success with just spamming an absolute crazy amount of Plague Marines now. At least on paper that does seem quite intimidating with the sheer amount of them that you can put on the board. Next up, we've got the Legion of Tzeentch of the Thousand Suns, again an army that maybe hasn't been having the most massive amount of success in Arks of Omen, run by a chap called Liam. Overall, I feel like this one maybe isn't enormously different to Thousand Suns type list that we saw in Nephilim. Leading the list is Ahriman on a disc and an Infernal Master. Ahriman's got a couple of mortal wound powers plus Presage. The Infernal Master has Weaver of Fates, which I guess would likely be good on the Scarab Occult Terminators or the Spawn, Master Misinformator for a bit of redeployment shenanigans, and the Umbralefic Crystal to teleport himself and a unit across the board. Then in the troop section there's 6 units of 5 Rubik Marines, quite heavy on the Warp Flamers these, with 4 units of them and 2 units with the Bolters, a small mix of psychic powers within the units, there's Glamour of Tzeentch, a couple of copies of Temporal Surge, and 3 copies of Doombolt. There's two big blocks of Scarab Occult Terminators, one that looks like it's maybe the focal point for any buffs, with a couple of Hellfire missiles, Soul Reaper cannons, and a protege who gets Empiric Guidance, and then a slightly smaller squad that takes Rites of Coalescence on the Aspiring Sorcerer. That's the one for healing a model that was injured but not killed. Otherwise, Spawn got a little bit cheaper for the Thousand Suns, and they were kind of good already. There's one unit of 5 and 2 single units of 1. The unit of 5 I think is really quite efficient if you give it the 4+ Invul save to make it pretty tough as well. A small unit of 3 is Angor Enlightened, who'd be quite nice for actions and objectives, and a Chaos Rhino that picks up a bit of free gear. It's both got a Havoc Launcher and 2 Inferno Combi Bolters, not a bad source of firepower in itself for a transport. Overall looks very solid, maybe no enormous crazy skew to either 100% Scarab Occult Terminators or 100% Rubric Marines, but maybe a few more Spawn than the average list might have had before. Next up we've got some Chaos Knights. We've got a list here by Alex Towers, who was 10th at Uprising Adelaide. Again, another competitive list in a big tournament that only took a single loss, and placed pretty highly as well. The house used is the Indomitable Herpatrax with the extra wounds on each of the knight, but perhaps more importantly the Iconoclast melee buff, which makes all of the knights fight a lot harder in combat. The list also does make use of all 7 of the possible available slots as well. You're able to take a knight's list with also an allied Dreadblade knight, so it basically means that you can have 7 different slots to play with rather than 6. In the list there's 3 individual Wardog Carnivore units, all of them have stubbers and they're all fielded individually. That means that you have a fair bit more flexibility with setting them up and also not having to deploy all of them at once, so the enemy might reveal a few more drops. One of them also takes the Blood Shield as well with the Helm of Dogs, so that one gets an Ignore Invul saves for a turn, an extra attack to punch through all those Invuls with, plus some rerolls for nearby War Dogs too. Then there's 2 big squadrons of 3 War Dog Stalkers. These guys certainly put out a fair bit of firepower, as they all have the Chain Cannons, Slaughter Claw and Stubbers, so it means they have an awful lot of anti-infantry shooting, but a lot of anti-tank melee. I feel like the mass chain cannons are perhaps particularly interesting. I feel like a lot of War Dog lists tended to be a bit heavier on the thermal cannons. I kind of wonder if this might be partly a meta response and expecting to see fewer very, very high saves around. In any case, they'd certainly deal with vehicles very solidly in melee with Iconoclast and the damage D3+3. One of them takes Beguiling Majesty for some extreme durability in close, and one of them has the Nurgle Aura of Corruption, potentially debuffing enemy units a little bit, and if they get favoured then it gets extra good with -1 toughness too. Otherwise, to round up the list, there's a bit of Wardog fire support. There's one Wardog Executioner who's a Dreadblade with Worthy Offerings for +1 to hit against high value targets. He's a good choice for holding down home objectives, having the Mirror of Fates for some command point farming, and the Helm of Warp Sights to ignore modifiers. There's then a unit of 3 Wardog Brigands, Dreadblades with the Biomechanical Fusion trait. That's the one that allows the Dreadblades to get the Demonic Surge trait, so they can basically have the infernal benefits of cutting their health for a few different powerful boosts, including a +1 to wound with their guns. That's kind of cool, and I've not seen that used all that much. You wouldn't have to make use of it if it didn't make sense to, but perhaps getting a +1 to wound with those chain cannons could be really big if you're going for some late game critical damage. Overall, it's a slightly new flavour of mass war dogs, a little bit more flexibility for more of those fun demonic favours, which I think is generally a good thing. Chaos Knights have certainly had a fair bit of a boost with their secondary objectives getting a lot better as well. Hopefully that should have them catching up with their Imperial counterparts a bit. They were lagging behind a bit last season. Finally, for the Realm of Chaos, we've got the Chaos Demons list by Matt Morosoli. I had already mentioned this one on the channel before. This one was an Arks of Omen Elites detachment, and it placed highly at that enormous Uprising Adelaide tournament, mainly being a Bloodthirster Lord of Change, supported by a bunch of fairly fast-moving demons. The list is headed up by Bloodthirster with the Great Axe and Argath King of Blades, a monstrous amount of damage 3 attacks coming out of that, and has Indomitable Onslaught, so it can't lose more than 8 wounds in a phase. Really a big deal if you can only kill it with shooting. There's then a Lord of Change with the Bolt of Change, Boon of Change, and Infernal Gateway, massive amounts of mortal wounds, and the boon that allows you to make it tougher. That could also flex into a damage boost for the Flamers if needed. The Lord of Change is just annoyingly hard to kill. It's got Incorporeal Form for a -1 to wound, Impossible Robe for ignoring 1 failed save each phase, and Master Mutator for more mortal wound damage, particularly brutal with the splash damage of Infernal Gateway. Then to lead up the Slanesh units, there's a Transweaver with Hysterical Frenzy. With her 4 buffs between her innate things and that psychic power, it means that Demonette units just get absolutely vicious in melee with her buffs. Extra attacks with exploding 6s plus rerolls is generally a good thing. For the Slanesh units for her to buff, there's 2 units of Demonettes, very fast moving objective secured, plus a couple of Fiends which are also core. They're even faster moving with 14 inches and get damage to attacks at base. Otherwise, there's a bunch more interesting stuff. A unit of Bloodletters that might be kind of nice coming out of Deep Strike Reserve against the right opponent, particularly if you lessen the opponent's leadership to get them in close. A unit of Pink Horrors, which are now cheaper and a quite good durable objective holding. Some Nurglings to start in the midfield to get to work on those early objectives. 2 units of 5 Flamers, apparently still perfectly efficient enough even when they don't auto-hit. And then perhaps some of the biggest winners of the Arks of Omen changes, 3 units of 5 Fleshhounds. At only 15 points per model now, these guys are just very efficient. 2 wounds at toughness 4 with the 4+ demon saves, and 3 strength 5 and AP 2 attacks on the charge. Overall, a whole load of raw strength here, lots of things that move fast and have damage outputs that you just can't really ignore, and certainly the 2 big hitters are going to be quite hard to remove without some thought. Overall, doesn't seem to be too bad a time for Chaos Demons, they're performing quite well so far, I think. And now let's move on to Xenos, and we'll start with the various flavours of Eldar. This first one being a Craftworlds list by James Grover of Goonhammer, who used it to take forth at that DZTV GT. Eldar got a bit of a mixed bag out of the update, with some points nerfs and some buffs. The option not to take any troops if they didn't want to, but still no enormous amount of help with their secondary objectives or primary scoring. The Craftworld used for this list, which took 4 wins and 1 loss, was the Orthway Craftworld. They give a whole host of different boosts, including a buff to Psychic, a single reroll, an invul save, and a feel no pain against mortal wounds. Kind of cool to see the list headed up by the Avatar of Cain plus a bunch of Aspect Warriors, all very fluffy. I guess the Avatar is just a reasonably cheap and scary threat that you can throw down the middle, and is one of the more durable units that the Craft Worlds have. There's Baharoth, who can jump on and off the board with his objective secured, and just take a chunk out of the enemy each time he goes. And then a couple of Seers, Eldrad Ulthran with Guide, Doom, Fortune, and he takes his Warlord trait Fate Weaver, and then a single Warlock on foot with Protect or Jinx. He's got the Seer of the Shifting Vector, and has Falshoe's Wing for a bit more mobility. As per normal with Eldar, the combination of Doom, Guide, and Jinx is likely to make the vast majority of units efficient at killing just about anything, but are perhaps particularly nice with high flurries of attacks like Howling Banshees. Despite Eldar troops often being much maligned, there still seem to be 2 units of 5 Rangers here. Forward deploy, objective secured, and doing actions is reasonable enough, I guess. There's the common combo of a unit of Howling Banshees with Mirror Swords and Piercing Strikes. That gives you an Exarch with a glorious amount of damage to Power Sword attacks, and Striking Scorpions with the Biting Blade and Crushing Blows. That's the one to auto wound with a fairly dangerous weapon. I'd guess that pair team up and ride in the Wave Serpents. Then there's a unit of the now cheaper Shroud Runners, which are really quite efficient little utility units now. 90 points for 3 of them with the snipers and the scatter lasers, and at least reasonably tough to kill in cover. They've got a big pre-game move as well, which can potentially clear out backfield units if you desperately need something to have some damage on it. There's a unit of Warp Spiders, where the Exarch takes the extra spinner and the Power Blades. They've got the Web of Deceit Exarch power. A single cheap Viper, which is quite a nice one for trading on objectives. Again, for the cheap cost of 40 points, it's reasonably tough as Eldar go. And then perhaps the most interesting and fun picks out of the list are a Wraith Seer with the D cannon for a bit of ignores line of sight firepower and quicken plus restrain. And perhaps most fun of all is a Wraith Knight with a Ghost Glaive, Wraith Cannon, and a couple of scatter lasers. Really cool to see someone having success with these. They basically just haven't been played virtually at all since the Eldar Codex came out. I guess now maybe isn't the worst time for them in the world, seeing as they actually get their faction traits now when they didn't before. I guess it makes them a little bit more efficient if you get a big reroll with one of those enormous guns, plus the invul save and defense against mortals. Might divide fire priorities a bit between the Avatar and this guy. They're both fairly tough, have a debuff on damage and a ton of wounds. Overall, quite a cool list, pretty awesome to see a Wraith Knight doing well. Next up, I thought it was worth covering Ynnari as well. I feel like they're worthy of their own entry, as they do seem to be doing really quite strongly in Arks of Omen at the moment, and this was a list by a Clement Tournard, who used it to take first at Oxford Onslaught, a 5-round grand tournament of 30 players. The Ynnari Arks of Omen detachment had a fast attack focus to get some Drukhari Hellions on the field, and overall has a bit of overlap with some efficient units from the Craftworld list, but also dips into Harlequins and Drukhari for some melee. The list is headed up by the near-mandatory Incarn. Hard to go too far wrong, fairly tough, very dangerous with ignore invuls, and also cast some psychic powers. A Farseer with Fateful Divergence and Ancestor's Grace. Fateful Divergence farming up the command points, and Ancestor's Grace being +1 to wound, pretty excellent on the Farseers, and you can combine it with the Warlord trait Ambush of Blades on the same model. That's the one that gives the Harlequin troops an extra pip of AP, really helpful on their mass AP-2 weapons. There's then a Shadow Seer with Mirror of Minds for the really quite powerful focus Witchfire, and then Shield of Iniad as well to give you a 4+ invul save on a unit. Could be helpful on a fair few targets that, and either the Harlequins or the Hellions seem like a pretty reasonable choice. There's then a bunch of Flying Warlocks, a unit of 3 of them with the most common picks Protect and Jinx, and one with Quicken and Restrain. And then there's also one that takes Embolden or Horrify. I'm going to be guessing mainly using Horrify to make enemy units fight last. I guess any of these could jump around and use Psychic Secondaries if they needed to as well, to maybe do some mental interrogation. For the units that they're leading, there's again 2 units of 5 Rangers for some objectives and things. They unlock 2 units of 9 Harlequins in the troop slot. The units go full in on their unique melee gear, 5 or 6 Harlequins Kisses, 1 Embrace and 1 Caress. A seriously brutal amount of melee damage when you combine it with the buffs that the Farseer can give them. There's then that unit of Howling Banshees with the Mirror Swords and Piercing Strikes. She also takes Crone Scream on the Exarch, and the Striking Scorpions with Biting Blade and Crushing Blows, and I'd guess the Wave Serpent which they're probably going to be riding in. There's then a great big unit of the more expensive Swooping Hawks, 10 of them with the Phoenix Plume for some more defense. They should hopefully be jumping on and off the board, thinning out the enemy hordes, while hopefully remaining as safe as possible. Another nice and cheap Viper in the fast attack slot, and those 2 units unlock 2 units of Drukhari Hellions, one great big one of 9 with Adrenalites, and 1 unit of 5 with Hypex for extra speed. Again, those will be pretty solid targets of any buffs that you can get going. Certainly fit in pretty nicely with Ynnari melee. Overall, as per normal with Eldar, a lot of very fast and very dangerous threats, and particularly some stacked buffs that you can put on Harlequins or maybe Hellions. Ynnari really weren't doing too bad in terms of win rates and tournament performance and things last season. It looks like that's set to continue. Next up for the Eldar, we've got the Drukhari. Again, perhaps an army that's been kind of medium in terms of performance last season, and didn't really have too much change in Arks of Omen besides a couple of small fiddling to points on troops. This list was run by Simon Laxton, who used it to get 4 wins and just 1 loss at a big grand tournament of 30 players, called UCG's Galaxy in Grasp. I'm not 100% sure whether or not this was before or after Games Workshop fixed the Drukhari rules. I'd guess it was probably after, seeing as it appears to be organised into an Arks of Omen detachment plus a patrol of witches. I must admit I'm currently a little bit on the hazy side about which sub-factions of Drukhari get what rules in what detachments. To my understanding, I think that you just get the Coven Dark Creed benefits here, but the Kabbalite warriors wouldn't get anything, and the witches in the patrol detachment will get Berserk Fugue. I might be wrong though, please correct me below if the Kabbalites do get Black Heart or something. In any case, it looks like he's gone with the option of Drazar being the Warlord. His Warlord trait is rather powerful, re-rolling hits and wounds, so he does make a mess of anything that he gets in combat with the +1 to wounds. There's also a Succubus with the Triptych Whip, Precision Blows, Adrenalite and Master Succubus, generally a tried and tested combo with a whole bunch of damage 2 attacks plus some mortal wounds. The Berserk Fugue one is really quite a nice custom witch one. That's the one where it gets you exploding 6s to hit on the charge, plus a 5+ save against mortal wounds in return, and those are 2 fairly solid buffs for the witches. Dark Creed's obsession is Distillers of Fear. They subtract 1 from leadership and combat attrition tests, and you also get +1 to hit in melee against units that have got a worse leadership characteristic than yours. Overall, it looks like what they're going for here is a bit of a spooky, scary morale debuffing Drukhari army, which really is quite cool. There's a bunch of sets of Grizzly trophies on the Venoms. They'd give you an extra -2 to morale debuff as well, so potentially hitting them with a lot of debuffs there. It'd be very nice for getting those Phantasm Grenade launchers to be throwing out a whole bunch of mortal wounds, plus making enemy units fight last with Incubi. Otherwise, going through the list, it looks like a lot of the units are loaded up into a set of 3 Raiders with Dark Lances and Phantasm Grenades, and then 3 Venoms with Grizzly trophies and dual Splinter Cannons. Out of the units, there's 5 squads of 5 Kabbalite Warriors with Blasters and Phantasm Grenade launchers to deal out the mortal wound pain, 3 units of 5 Racks, each of which takes an Electro-Corrosive Whip and the Ossifactor. I wonder if they might be mounted in the Venoms potentially. That could allow you to get that double leadership debuff on the go. There's a unit of 5 Witches, again with a Phantasm Grenade launcher and 2 random drugs, 3 units of 5 Incubi, which I guess would be in the Raiders, 2 units of 6 Mandrakes, maybe 6 of them to go around retrieving data potentially, and then 2 units of 6 Hellions looking very, very threatening in that Witch Cult, again taking 2 random drugs. Overall, a pretty fun looking Drukhari list. I feel like there's a couple of fun things going on there between the multiple morale debuff thing going on, plus perhaps a few more Witch units than I'd often see. Next up, we've got some Harlequins. This one was run by someone called Raven at a tournament in Spain. As best I can tell, it was an individual tournament. It seemed to say solos as opposed to team. Maybe it was organised by Team Spain or something. Harlequins got hit very, very hard by the nerfs. 4+ and 3+ invul saves across the board going down by 1 pip. Previously, they could be kind of annoying to remove from the table, with the 4+ invul saves having the chance to spike high, plus a few luck dice to help make that happen. I generally guess they're still probably going to perform okay, but just have to really rely on their mobility to hide behind terrain at all times, and I suspect they're going to be a fair bit less standout. This list seems to indicate that Harlequins can still do pretty well at decent sized tournaments as well. This one was a 5-round, I think around 40 player event, and with Harlequins not really having all that many units to choose from, this is basically one of each of the characters, a bunch of troops in the Starweavers, plus some Skyweaver jet bikes. Leading the list is a Shadowseer with Twilight Pathways, Mirror of Minds, and the Player of Twilight Warlord trait. Extra speed, a good Witchfire, and some command point farming, I believe. A Fighty Troop Master with a Twilight Fang, Veiled King, and another Warlord trait that I think was unlisted, I suspect amping up his melee further. A Solitaire for some blitzing melee goodness, and then a Death Jester with that previously kind of banned combo with Favour of Segarak plus Harvesters of Torment. That's the one where you get triple exploding 6s to hit with his Shrieker Cannon, and then you can flip one of the dice to be an automatic 6, so you pretty much guarantee a bunch of damage on the target. You now can do that again, it just costs far more. That one model is now 110 points, but he really is a premier sniper. He's a genuinely very big threat to any sort of support character. Then for the bulk of the list, these are the more fighty Harlequins as they're using Twilight. They get an extra attack in combat each. They take slightly more troops than you would have been able to in a battalion, with 2 units of 6 troops with 5 kisses and embrace and 2 fusion pistols, 4 more shooty ones with 2 neurodisruptors, 2 fusion pistols and 3 kisses, and then 1 single unit of 5 with no upgrades. Looks like there's just the 5 Starweavers, so I guess one of the melee ones will be starting on foot. I guess the cheap ones are probably just there to hold down home objectives or be more expendable than the rest. Then there's a bunch of Skyweaver jet bikes, one being a unit of 4 with the Zephyrglaives and the Shuriken Cannons, a pretty hefty melee threat there with Twilight, and then 2 smaller ones with Shuriken Cannons and Star Bolus, probably a bit more running interference, perhaps could be interesting enough for jumping behind enemy lines. Overall, good to see Harlequins are still able to compete, even if it looks like they're going to be far less dominant than they ever were before. I did suspect that with their movement tricks, they still would find a way to work, even if you did take a lot of their durability away. Next up, for the other army that really got hit by the nerf bat very hard in Arks of Omen, are Tyranids. In general, they have gone from an army that was dominating top tables to one that's really struggling quite a bit. This one was one of the better lists I could find. 3 wins and no losses, and taking second at a small 12-player event. This list, though, I did find pretty interesting. Really looks like it's embracing the new Tyranids, and it was run by Bryant Nelson. The list is a Jormungandr one, so that's the hive fleet that basically counts you as being in light cover. Really quite nice for the Carnifexes with their 2+ saves. And they also pick up Territorial Instincts from Lurk, so that is objective secured on all those big beasties. This one almost is a pure Nidzilla list. There's only a few supporting infantry units, 1 squad of Tyranid warriors with Scything Talons, Devourers, and a Venom Cannon. I guess they're at least partly there for triggering the Combat Synaptic Imperative for the Carnifexes. 2 cheap interference Sky Slasher swarms, basically rippers but faster, and 3 Tyrant Guards to protect the Hive Tyrant with Rending Claws and Scything Talons. The Hive Tyrant in question this time is a Walking Hive Tyrant, a character protected Heavy Venom Cannon, and a Bone Sword upgraded to the Reaper of Obliterax. He's got the Adrenal Glands, Synaptic Tendrils for buffing 2 units at once, and Paroxysm and Psychic Scream for some mortal wounds out of his psychic powers. Otherwise, in the HQ section, we've got a Neurothrope, Catalyst Onslaught, and Paroxysm there. He's got Direct Guidance to allow you to get +1 to hit on 1 core unit, could be handy on those Carnifexes. And he's also got the Resonance Barb for better casting and more powers. I did feel like the Neurothrope maybe came through particularly well out of Tyranid units. I'm sure the Neurothrope will also be giving its cast on 3d6 to the Maliceptor, who's here as well. He's got Neuroparasite and Psychic Scream, so very, very mortal wound heavy, and each time he manages to cast, he's going to hopefully be chucking out that 3 mortal wound aura. If he rolls well, he can still be chucking out 10 mortal wounds at close range. Really not bad for at least a somewhat durable bug who counts as 5 model OBSEC. Then finally we get onto the meat damage dealers of the list, which are a serious amount of Carnifexes in the heavy support section. 1 big unit of 3 of the standard ones with enhanced senses, heavy venom cannons and scything talons. A good amount of anti-tank firepower there, and their core units for the buffs, though they did go up in points a bit in Arks of Omen. and then 5 individual Screamer Killer Carnifexes, the ones with the Bioplasma Scream and extra melee damage. They all take adrenal glands to hurtle them over to the foe, and that also allows them to use the extra attack stratagem if they need. One of them also has Toxin Sacks, I'd guess to fill up some more points. Overall, there is rather a lot of OBSEC monsters, lots of 2+ saves and -1 damage going on with the Carnifexes there. Might well be a challenge for a list that hasn't brought enough anti-tank. I feel like Tyranids are a codex that have plenty of other options. Hopefully they will find some good things to fall back on. I do wonder if some more Turbigon heavy lists with Gorgon swarms and things might do a bit better when some of the other things have got nerfed. Next up, for one of the more improved armies of Arks of Omen, we've got the Genestealer Cults. These guys got a bunch of helpful points cuts, and one example of a competitive list is this one by Matt Watson, who used it to take third at a 30-player 5-round event, UCG Galaxy and Grasp. I was wondering if at some point we might see some aberrants doing well, but this list appears to be a bit more one of the traditional ones, sticking with industrial efficiency for ignoring the penalty on the rock weapons and mining weapons, and then backing that up with accustomed to toil and deep supplies. Accustomed to toil is mini transhuman physiology, you can't wound them on 2s, and deep supplies is a little damage boost, re-rolling 1 wound roll whenever a unit shoots or fights. The Arks of Omen detachment used has a fast attack focus. As you might expect for the Genestealer Cults, there's a whole load of characters used here. There's the new and slightly cheaper Primus, who was already pretty good, so I don't really know why he went down. A Biophagus with the Familiar, and using Alchemist Supreme to give the 15 units of Neophytes a 5+ feel no pain. A Kelemorph for some Assassination Pistol goodness. An Exos with some command point farming cranial inlays. And then interestingly, a Reductus Saboteur who takes the Oppressor's Bane pistol and lying in wait to pop up right next to the enemy. I'd guess that Oppressor's Bane pistol is used to put down crossfire tokens on the enemy if you need them. A little bit unsure on that one, as it would conflict with using the Reductus Explosive shooting attack. Otherwise though, for the mainline damage dealers, there's a huge unit of 15 Acolytes with a Trap Sprung. That's the one to give you 3d6 drop the lowest when you're charging, and I guess if you're dropping outside of 8 inches and you're wanting to charge, that's a pretty reasonable chance to get in with a command reroll. They're really quite a big fighting melee units, with 5 rock drills for a whole bunch of mortal wounds, plus 5 hand flamers and a cult icon. I feel like particularly with the Primus buffs, most of the time when they drop, whatever they charge is going to die. There's then a whole load of neophytes, going pretty heavy on the troops here with the higher allowance. 7 units of 10 with 2 seismic cannons and a power pick in each. 3 of the squads take auto guns and grenade launchers. 4 of the squads take weapons and shotguns for a bit more close range duties. I guess the idea with them is to get some mass crossfire goodness going on the targets with all of those seismic cannons, as well as being a whole load of OBSEC infantry bodies. There's 2 units of pure strain Genestealers. One of them takes that They Came From Below upgrade, the one that allows them to either set up on the board with a pre-game move or disappear if that doesn't make sense. 2 units of 5 Atalan Jackals with a grenade launcher and the Atalan power weapons, which you now get for free. The base cost of the units did go up though. There's 2 Achilles Ridge Runners with flare launchers and heavy mining lasers, and then a couple of Goliaths, 1 rock grinder with a seismic cannon and demo charges, and 1 truck just with the charges. I suppose that rock grinder would have to be empty or just have one of the characters in, and I guess the truck would probably take a neophyte squad. In any case, looks like Genestealer Cults are having a bit of a better time of it at the moment. A few slightly cheaper characters and a bit of free gear on the Neophytes and Acolytes doesn't hurt. Looks like they're a list that'll score pretty hard on the secondaries, including that nice Brood Swarm one. Moving onwards, next up we have a Tower Empire list. This one by a Hazen Waldock who used it to take third at that big Uprising Adelaide tournament. Again, 7 wins and 1 loss here. I did talk about the list earlier on the channel, but I did think it was pretty interesting that it's a Borkhan list being run. It gives a bit of a damage debuff against vehicles and battlesuits for light weapons targeting them, longer range, and a scary ignores invul stratagem that could apply to one of the Riptide's ion accelerators perhaps. As I'd probably expect from any Tau list, it takes 2 commanders, a Cold Star and an Enforcer. The Cold Star takes the Seeker of Perfection trait for some spams mortal wounds, and the 2 boosted burst cannons, and a couple of Tau Flamers and a target lock. The Enforcer is really quite a high investment one with 3 cyclic ion blasters and a thermoneutronic projector, the relic flamer thing with 2 damage. He takes the excellent precision of the Hunter for the big rerolls, and the Begel Hunter's plates for a little bit of toughness plus a marker drone. I kind of feel like you're probably getting into diminishing returns by the time you pick up the 3rd cyclic ion blaster, but you wouldn't be able to get around the fact that this guy's going to stack some really big damage on whatever it targets. Then there's an Ethereal with the hover drone, an exemplar of Cao Yon, that's the redeployment trait. He takes the Humble Stave to cast 2 invocations, and the Storm of Fire rapid movement 1, and the command point farming ability. He's also got a couple of helpful character protected marker lights. Then there's 3 dangerous devilfish with 2 units of breachers and a unit of pathfinders inside them. The pathfinders pick up a few rail rifles and all 3 of their unique drones. Breacher devilfish can definitely be very dangerous. I think it's kind of rare to see the unique drones in the pathfinder units. I guess they'd be able to spam out a few marker lights as well. There's 2 sets of cheap screening Kroot hounds with their pre-game moves, and then the list finishes up with 4 heavy hitters, 2 hammerheads with their railguns, burst cannons, and 2 seeker missiles each, and then 2 big riptides with the ion accelerator and plasma rifles, multi-tracker, target lock, and velocity trackers. One of them takes a shielded missile drone for a little bit of extra defense. It's fun to see a Borkhan list here. I guess having the points increased to the crisis suits might have been some motivation to take fewer of them, or in this case none. Plus the Sun Sharks also appear to have disappeared from this list. Games Workshop hit bombers very hard with their nerf. Next up, we've got the new leagues of Votann Space Dwarves. These guys got some further slightly painful points increases on top of what they already had, particularly Hearthkin Warriors going up, though I guess they do have some advantage in being the only faction with an Armour of Contempt equivalent with their Void Armour now. In general, not an enormous amount of performance at big events, but here is a list that won a 3-game small tournament of 14 players run by a Gregory McIntosh. This one's going down the Great Etherean League and just blast away entire chunks of your opponent's army with the big rail cannon type approach. Perhaps the single scariest little death cluster in the centre is Uthar the Destined to allow you to flip one of the wound rolls to an automatic 6 and thereby trigger the Hecaton Land Fortress rail cannon's big splash effects. If you use the Hunter's Mark stratagem to auto-hit, it basically guarantees you a big 10 damage on just about any target, vehicle or squad, and is kind of utterly terrifying as a death laser deletion ray. Uthar can also throw out the judgment tokens with Experienced Eye, and the land fortresses have a whole bunch of other guns going for them as well, with the bolt cannons that now get the 3 shots post the FAQ, plus the matter auto cannons as well. They're also supported by the Brockier Forge Master with Master Armourer as well, healing big wounds on them, negating damage, and making 1 hit on 2s for good measure. Otherwise, leading the list, there's also a Carl with a Mass Gauntlets, Rampart Crest, and a Vulcanite gun. He takes Actol's Fortress for Fights Last, plus Pragmatic Wisdom. It means there should be a decent amount of judgment tokens coating the enemy, and the Great Etherean League is generally quite good with them. They're the ones that count the target as being 1 judgment token higher than it would normally be, so you only need 1 to be auto-wounding on a 5+, or 2 to be auto-wounding on 4s. With all the points increases, 2 land fortresses and 3 characters take up quite a chunk of your list now, almost half of it all in all. But supporting them are a unit of 10 Hearthkin Warriors, who take the Bolter's Magna Rail Rifle and the 3 upgrades, 5 Chthonian Berserks, these ones with the Plasma Axes and a Mole Grenade Launcher. They went up a bit, but if you can get a Great Etherean Judgment token on those, then they're going to stack a crazy amount of auto wounds. I guess you could hide them in a land fortress if it made sense. The vast majority of the rest of the points, though, are all ploughed into those excellent Herdkin Pioneer bikes. Fast-moving OBSEC with fairly general-purpose guns, plus some very nice support upgrades with the comms and scanner to ignore cover in different ways, allow some stratagems, and allow the searchlights to throw out another judgment token if you badly need one on 1 given target. There's 2 units of 6 of them and 1 unit of 4. Really not too surprised that after they made troops non-mandatory, Votann lists might be pivoting to a whole ton of these. Overall, looks like the slightly memey combo of the rail cannon that just deletes something each turn is still alive and well, though admittedly compared with before all the big points rises, you don't get anywhere near as much big supporting stuff as you used to. Next up, we've got a list for the Necrons. This one's by a guy called Arvid, who used it to take first at the Fantasia North Store Championship, a 5-round GT. I think this one was around 30 players. With their tried and tested combo of the pre-game move plus objective secured broken, Necrons either have the option of going Nihilak for whole army OBSEC, or going for something like Nerve-Rock or Mephrit for more damage. This one's chosen to go Nihilak and take an Elite's Focus Arks of Omen detachment, quite a nice mix of units here. The Silent King heads up the army with his Warlord trait as a scary, good damage dealer, fights last centerpiece, and one that gives out some big buffs to nearby units with their shooting and melee. He's backed up by a Chronomancer and a Technomancer. The Chronomancer takes the Veil of Darkness and Implacable Conqueror to allow you to teleport a unit alongside him and then get a boost to your charge. That could be good on the Scorpec Destroyers potentially, I guess. Teleporting the Locust to get a key angle could also be pretty big though. There's then a Technomancer who looks like he wants to run with the Spiders. He's got a Canoptic Control node for making them +1 to hit, Voltaic Staff for some extra shooting, and the Thrall of the Silent King Warlord trait. The spiders have a gloom prism and some claws, but perhaps the most notable thing they do is just hoover out a crazy amount of low AP damage with all of those particle beamer shots with strength 6. That should be 36 of them hitting on 3s with the +1 to hit with the Canoptic control node. There's a Transcendent Catan with Cosmic Tyrant. He takes Antimatter Meteor and Sky of Falling Stars for some mortal wound goodness. Two big blocks of 6 Scorpec Destroyers, all very nice, particularly if you can get the Silent King's buffs on them. The 3 Canoptic Spiders, some Scarab Swarms, which I guess will be quite nice with the spiders potentially healing them. 6 Wraiths with the Claws, really quite nice in an Obsec list with Nihilak. 3 Tomb Blades with the Particle Beamers, nice for getting to work on those early objectives. And then a big unit of 6 Locust Destroyers, including 1 heavy with the Gauss. They're going to be a very nice unit for using stratagems on, and the Silent King's rerolls. Good to see the Necrons winning one of the tournaments right at the start of the season. It was kind of an interesting combo of lots and lots of points buffs, but some big rules nerfs. I feel like they'll probably be in an alright spot when the dust settles. I do wonder if we might see a few more lists with lots of Necron warriors, now they went down to 11 points with those Gauss Reapers. Finally, last but not least, we have the green tide that is the Orks, recently narrowly missing out on winning the Las Vegas Open, and they only really got better going into Nephilim. This list by Tom Higginbottom came fourth at the Bolton War, going 4-1 against a field of 34 players. As seems to be dominant right now, the Goths clan is in ascendancy. Massive extra melee damage with exploding 6s to hit and a +1 strength on the charge, which combos nicely with the +1 strength that you get from the War. The Arks of Omen detachment is elites focused, plus a heroic support for the extra boss. There's 2 rather fighty war bosses here, one with Edwopper's Kill Chopper, a Combi Scorcher, and the proper Killy Goths trait, and then one with the Killer Claw, Combi Scorcher, and Brutal but Cunning. Some very nasty damage 3 attacks that you get to have a second attempt at if you don't make damage. Boss Zagstruck's here as a fast moving fighty goth melee boy. There's a weird boy with Warpath and Fists of Gork, who looks like he's pretty much tailor-made to make the bosses fight extra hard, and then rather a lot of Orc infantry fightiness out of the squads. It looks like most of the army would typically want to load up into transport. There's 3 units of 10 Beast Snagger boys, which could fit in the truck and the battle wagons, maybe with a unit of knobs in each. I guess you'd have a bit of flexibility as to where you put them. Beast Snagger boys with their choppers are looking a bit better now Armour of Contempt isn't a thing. And perhaps one of the bigger winners out of the Orc points changes were knobs going down a bit with their war gear. There's 2 units of 8 of them here, 4 with power claws and 4 with big choppers. It looks like knobs might be a bit of a unit to watch. They do seem to be getting a lot more popular than they have been recently. Otherwise, there's 3 units of Gretchen, 1 with horrible gits, excellent to do things like get the good bits and just stand on objectives. 2 squads of 10 commandos to start in the midfield. Those being Goths commandos, they can really threaten quite a meaty first turn charge if you do get lucky and go first. And then 3 rather big units of 10 Storm Boys, each with a power claw. Again, just all around scary combat troops, and they've got some great movement to be able to jump from cover to cover, or just engage the enemy over a very long distance when you are. Finally, there's 2 battle wagons, each of which take an hard case to give you the toughness 8. No death rolls on these, and there's also a truck as well. In general, early Orcs results do seem to be going quite well in Arks of Omen. Looks like there's plenty of cause to be positive. I wouldn't be too surprised if we saw a fair few more knobs units after that discounted gear. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed a bit of a big video. Lots of interesting developments happening for the factions in Arks of Omen. Let me know what you make of the army list down in the comments below, and as always, tell me anything that I might have missed or misunderstood about the list. There are an awful lot of factions here, and of course I'm not the person who wrote or played these. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we'll certainly have plenty more Warhammer 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new stuff just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next in the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.